Voyage of the Thetis. As soon as the Thetis had obtained her complement, she was ordered to join the squadron of Admiral Murray, which was being fitted out for North America, whither, soon after the declaration of war against England by the French Convention, the government had despatched orders to seize the islands of St. Pierre and Miquelon, previously captured from the French in 1778, but restored at the termination of the American War. It was in order to regain these islands, and for the protection of our commerce and fisheries generally, that a stronger force on the Nova Scotia station was deemed essential. The conduct of the American people was doubtful, as, from the assistance rendered by the French in the War of Independence, and still more from the democratic institutions recently established in France, little doubt existed that their leaning would be upon the side of the enemy. The United States government, however, did all in its power to preserve neutrality by proclamations and addresses, but as its authority was little more than nominal, throughout the various states, a disposition on the part of American shipowners to assist the French in providing stores of every kind was manifested very soon after the declaration of war. On our return from Leith to Plymouth to join the Admiral, we detained several American vessels laden with corn and other provisions for French ports, one of the objects of Admiral Murray's squadron being to intercept traffic of this nature. The squadron sailed from Plymouth, and when about midway across the Atlantic, an incident occurred worth relating, as bearing upon a conjecture made a few years ago by the master and passengers of a merchant vessel regarding some vessels supposed, though erroneously, to form part of Sir John Franklin's expedition. One night, finding the temperature of the atmosphere rapidly decreasing, the squadron was proceeding under easy sail, with a vigilant look out for icebergs. At dawn we were close to a block of these, extending right across our path as far as the eye could reach. The only alternative was to alter our course and pass to leeward of the group, to which, from the unwonted sublimity of the site, we approached as nearly as seemed consistent with safety. The appearance of icebergs is now so well known that it would be superfluous to describe them. I shall only remark that, on passing one field of great extent, we were astonished at discovering on its sides 3 vessels, the one nearest to us being a polacca-rigged ship, elevated at least 100 feet, the berg having rolled round or been lightened by melting, so that the vessel had the appearance of being on a hill forming the southern portion of the floe. The story of 2 vessels answering the description of Sir John Franklin's ships having a few years ago been seen on an iceberg was scarcely credited at the time, but may receive corroboration from the above incident. Nothing can exceed the extraordinary aspect of these floating islands of ice, either as regards variety of form, or the wonderful display of reflected light which they present. But, however they may attract curiosity, ships should always give them a wide berth, the indraught of water on their weather side being very dangerous. A singular effect was experienced as we passed to leeward of the field. First, the intense cold of the wind passing over it, and occasionally the heat caused by the reflection of the sun's rays from the ice whenever the ship came within the angle of incidence. On our arrival at Halifax we found many American vessels which had been detained, laden with corn and provisions. These had been seized by our predecessors on the station, the act by no means tending to increase our popularity on subsequent visits along the United States coast. Another practice which was pursued has always appeared to me a questionable stretch of authority toward a neutral nation, viz. the forcible detention of English seamen whenever found navigating American ships. Of this the Government of the United States justly complained as inflicting severe losses on their citizens, whose vessels were thus delayed or imperilled for want of hands. The practice was defended by the British Government, but on what grounds I am not jurist enough to comprehend. Certain it is that should another continental war arise, such a course would be impracticable, for as American ships, whether of war or commerce, are now for the most part manned by British seamen, driven from the service of their country by an unwise abrogation of that portion of the navigation laws which fostered our own nursery for the navy. The effect of such an order would be to unman American ships, and it is questionable whether the United States Government would submit to such a regulation, even if it were inclined to put it in execution. On the 14th of January, 1795, Admiral Murray appointed me acting third lieutenant on the Thetis, though not 18 months had elapsed since my entrance into the service. Thanks to my worthy friend Jack Larmour, and to my own industry, it may be stated without vanity that I was not incompetent to fill the station to which the Admiral had promoted me. This unlooked for reward redoubled my zeal, and on the 13th of April following, I was made acting lieutenant of the Africa, Captain Rodham Home, who applied to the Admiralty for my services. This additional promotion was followed on the 6th of July by a provisional commission confirming my rank. The Africa was sent to scour the seaboard of the States in search of the enemy's vessels, but not falling in with any, we ran on to Florida, with similar ill success. An accident here occurred to me which left its mark through life. I had contrived a ball of lead, studded with barbed prongs, for the purpose of catching porpoises. One day the doctor laid me a wager against hurling the missile to a certain distance, and in the attempt a hook nearly tore off the forefinger of my right hand. A perhaps not very judicious course of reading had, at that time, led me to imbibe the notion of a current spurious philosophy, that there was no such thing as pain, and few opportunities were lost of parading arguments on the subject. As the doctor was dressing my hand, the pain was so intense that my crotchet was sadly scandalised by an involuntary exclamation of agony. "What?" said the doctor, "I thought there was no such thing as pain." Not liking to have a favourite theory so palpably demolished, the ready reply was that my exclamation was not one of pain, but mental only, arising from the sight of my own blood. He laughed, whilst I writhed on, but the lesson knocked some foolish notions out of my head. On the 5th of January, 1796, the first lieutenant of the Thetis having been promoted, an order was transmitted for me to quit the Africa and rejoin my uncle's ship, which I did in the Lynx, Captain Skene. An incident occurred during the passage worth relating. The Lynx one day overhauled an American vessel from France to New York, professedly in ballast. At first nothing was found to warrant her detention, but a more minute search brought to light from amongst the shingle ballast a number of casks filled with costly church plate, this being amongst the means adopted by the French Convention to raise supplies, an intention in this case thwarted by the vigilance of Captain Skene. The sagacity of Captain Skene was exemplified in another instance. Observing one day a quantity of stable litter on the surface of the sea, it was obvious that it could only arise from the transport of animals. Tracking the refuse to the southward, we overtook and captured a vessel laden with mules, for the use of one of the French possessions. The period having arrived at which the Admiralty regulations permitted young officers to offer themselves for examination, on rejoining the Thetis I was ordered up, and passed for lieutenant accordingly, my time as a midshipman being made up from my nominal rating on board the Vesuvius, etc., as narrated in a former chapter. The mention of this practice will, perhaps, shock the purists of the present day, who may further regard me as a stickler for corruption, for pronouncing its effect to have been beneficial. First, because, from the scarcity of lieutenants, encouragement was often necessary. Second, because it gave an admiral a power which he does not now possess, viz. That of selecting for commissions those who exerted themselves, and on whom he could rely, in place of having forced upon him young men appointed by parliamentary or other influence, of whom he could know nothing, except that they did not owe their commissions to practical merit. In my own subsequent career as a captain of a man-of-war, there was never the slightest difficulty as regarded men, yet no commander could, in this respect, be more particular. But of many officers furnished to me through the parliamentary influence, it can only be said that they were seldom trusted, as I considered it preferable, on pressing occasions, to do their duty myself; and this, as some of them had powerful influence, no doubt made me many enemies amongst their patrons. It is all very well to talk of the inordinate power exercised by commanding officers in former times, but whilst the Admiralty, even in our day, appears to extend a system in which influence has everything, and experience nothing, to do, the so-called corruption of old, which was never made use of but to promote merit, had its advantages. No instance in which the power then indirectly pertaining to admirals commanding having, to my knowledge, been abused. This adoption for political purposes of a baneful system may, in an unforeseen emergency, tend to overthrow the state, and nothing, in my opinion, can be more injurious to the navy than the usurpation of all distributive power by a ministry in exchange for parliamentary votes. In civil offices this may be merely obstructive. In the navy it is destructive. Systems like these are such as no state can long exist under securely, and history warns us that from perversion of patronage great states have fallen. During my absence in the Africa, I lost the chance of participating in a gallant attack made by the Honourable Captain Cochrane in the Thetis, and Captain Beresford in the Hussar, on 5 French ships, which they had been watching near the mouth of the Chesapeake. These ships were fallen in with at sea off Cape Henry, and on the approach of the Thetis and the Hussar, formed in line to receive them. The Hussar, being the smaller vessel, encountered the 2 leading ships, while the Thetis opened her broadside on the centre vessel, and the 2 in the rear. In half an hour the French Commodore and the second in line gave up the combat and made sail, leaving the others to the mercy of the 2 English frigates, which in another half hour compelled them to surrender, one of them, however, contriving to escape. 2. The Prevoyant, 36, and the Raison, 18, were secured and taken to Halifax, where they were fitted out as cruisers, and afterwards returned with the squadron to England. This action was the only one of any importance which occurred during the dreary 5 years that we were employed on the North American coast, and is here mentioned because it has been said I was present, which was not the case. In the year 1797, Admiral Murray was succeeded in the command by Admiral Vanderput, who, on the 21st of June, appointed me lieutenant in his flagship, the Resolution. On joining this ship a few days afterwards, my reception was anything but encouraging. Being seated near the Admiral at dinner, he inquired what dish was before me. Mentioning its nature, I asked him if he would permit me to help him. The uncourteous reply was, that whenever he wished for anything, he was in the habit of asking for it. Not knowing what to make of a rebuff of this nature, it was met by an inquiry if he would allow me the honour of taking wine with him. "I never take wine with any man, my lord," was the unexpected reply, from which it struck me that my lot was cast among Goths, if no worse. Never were first impressions more ill-founded. Admiral Vanderput had merely a habit of showing his worst features first, or rather of assuming those which were contrary to his nature. A very short time developed his true character, that of a perfect gentleman, and one of the kindest commanders living. In place of the hornet's nest figured to my imagination, there was not a happier ship afloat, nor one in which officers lived in more perfect harmony. The only drawback was that of wanting something better to do than cruise among the fogs of Newfoundland and Nova Scotia, an inglorious pursuit the more severely felt from the fact that each succeeding packet brought accounts of brilliant naval victories achieved in European waters. The French, after my uncle's capture of their store-ships, gave up all attempts to get supplies from America by means of their own vessels, and the United States Government concluded a treaty with England, in which both sides disclaimed all wish to pass the bounds observed by neutral nations, so that the squadron was without beneficial employment. Tired of the monotony of Halifax, Admiral Vanderput determined to winter in the Chesapeake, where he resided ashore. As it was his practice to invite his officers by turns to remain a week with him, our time was agreeably spent, the more so that there were several families in the vicinity which retained their affection for England, her habits and customs. Even the innkeeper of the place contrived to muster a tolerable pack of hounds, which, if not brought under the perfect discipline of their British progenitors, often led us into more danger than is encountered in an English field, in consequence of our runs frequently taking us amongst thick forests, the overhanging branches of which compelled us to lay ourselves flat on the horses' backs, in order to avoid the fate intended for the objects of the chase. Another of our amusements was shooting, and one day a circumstance took place of which I did not for a long time hear the last. Being invited to pass a week with the Admiral, who was about to give a dinner to his neighbours, it was my wish to add a delicacy to his table, and having heard that a particular locality abounded with wild hogs, it seemed practicable that a boar's head might grace the feast. On reaching the forest, nearly the first object encountered was a huge, wild-looking sow with a farrow of young pigs, and as the transition from boar's head to suckling pig was not great, a shot from my rifle speedily placed one in a preliminary condition for roasting. But porcine maternal affections had not entered into my calculations. The sow charged me with such ferocity that prompt retreat, however undignified, became necessary, for my weapon was now harmless. In short, so vigorous was the onslaught of the enemy, that it became necessary to shelter myself in the fork of a tree, my gun being of necessity left at the bottom. The enraged animal mounted guard, and for at least a couple of hours waited for my descent, when, finding no symptoms of unconditional surrender, she at length moved slowly off with the remainder of her family. As the coast was now clear, I came down and shouldered the defunct pig, hoping to be in time to add it to the Admiral's table, for which, however, it was too late. Having told the story with great simplicity, I found myself at dinner roasted instead of the pig, the changes on this theme being rung till it became rather annoying. By way of variation, the Admiral asked me for a toast, and, on my pleading ignorance of such customs, insisted on my giving a sentiment, whereupon I gave the Misses Tabbs, the point consisting in the fact that these ladies were each over 6 feet high, and in the gossip of the place were understood to be favourites of the Admiral. For a moment Admiral Vanderput looked grave, but thinking no doubt the retort a fair one, he joined in the laughter against himself, though from that day he never asked me for a toast. Those were days when even gentlemen did not consider it a demerit to drink hard. It was then, as it is now, a boast with me never in my life to have been inebriated, and the revenge was that my boast should be at an end. Rapid circulation of the bottle accordingly set in, but this I managed to evade by resting my head on my left hand, and pouring wine down the sleeve of my uniform coat. The trick was detected, and the penalty of drinking off a whole bottle was about to be enforced, when I darted from the room, pursued by some of the company, who at length got tired of the chase, and I passed the night at a farmhouse. Having paid so lengthened a visit to the United States, at a period almost immediately following their achievement of independence, a few remarks relative to the temper and disposition of the American people at that period may not be uninteresting. Thoroughly English in their habits and customs, but exasperated by the contumely with which they had been treated by former British governments, their civility to us was somewhat constrained, yet so thoroughly English as to convince us that a little more forbearance and common sense on the part of the home authorities might have averted the final separation of these fine provinces from the mother country. There is every reason to believe that the declaration of the Confederation of the United Colonies in 1775 was sincere, viz. That on the concession of their just demands, the colonies are to return to their former connections and friendship with Great Britain, but on failure thereof, this confederation is to be perpetual. In vain, however, did the more far-sighted of the English public remonstrate with the government, and in vain did the City of London, by their chief magistrate, urge the wrongs and loyalty of the colonists, even to memorialising the king to dismiss from his councils those who were misleading him. A deaf ear was turned to all remonstrance, and a determination to put down by force what could not, at first, be called rebellion, was the only reply vouchsafed. It was not till all conciliatory means had failed that the first Congress of Philadelphia asserted the cause and necessity of taking up arms in the defence of freedom. The second Congress of the same place, confederating the provinces under the title of the United States of America. The failure of those employed in conciliation to induce the colonists to return to their allegiance, the co-operation of the King of France in aid of the revolt, the discreditable war which followed, and the singular recoil of his own principles on the head of Louis XVI himself, are matters of history, and need not here be further alluded to. When the Thetis was first on the coast, the American Republic was universally recognised, and it must be admitted that our treatment of its citizens was scarcely in accordance with the national privileges to which the young republic had become entitled. There were, no doubt, many individuals amongst the American people who, caring little for the federal government, considered it more profitable to break than to keep the laws of nations, by aiding and supporting our enemy, and it was against such that the efforts of the squadron had been chiefly directed. But the way in which the object was carried out was scarcely less an infraction of those international laws which we were professedly enforcing. The practice of taking English seamen out of American vessels, without regard to the safety of navigating them when thus deprived of their hands, has already been mentioned. To this may be added the detention of vessels against which nothing contrary to international neutrality could be established, whereupon their cargoes became damaged, the compelling them, on suspicion only, to proceed to ports other than those to which they were destined, and generally treating them as though they were engaged in contraband trade. Of these transactions the Americans had a right to complain, but in other respects their complaints were indefensible, such as that of our not permitting them to send corn and provisions to France, a violation of neutrality into which, after declaration of blockade, none but an inexperienced government could have fallen. Though there was perhaps something in the collateral grievance that American ships were not permitted to quit English ports without giving security for the discharge of their cargoes in some other British or neutral port. It would be wearisome to enter into further details respecting the operations of a squadron so ingloriously employed, or to notice the subordinate part which a junior lieutenant could take in its proceedings. Suffice to say that after remaining 5 years on the North American station, the Thetis returned to England. End of chapter 3. Recording by Timothy Ferguson, Gold Coast, Australia.
We enjoy bringing these productions to you. Please leave a comment to tell us how we are doing. Oh, and why not subscribe as well? There's lots more to come.